Today, I think we're going to talk about what we're currently exploring in nutrition specifically. So, in the last episode, the last podcast, we were talking in general terms about um, many things that we're looking at in movement and nutrition, but we're going to focus a little bit more on the nutrition side of things today, particularly macronutrients, carbs and fats, and which of these is the ideal fuel source. I think for a long time we've been pursuing a similar line of thought to each other, but recently I've started to question things a little bit. So yeah, that's what we're going to get into today. Should we talk about what our perspective has been for a while with carnivore? We've talked a lot about carnivore on these
Yeah. Okay.
podcasts,
Yeah.
and what brought us to it.
So I thought if we step back just a little bit, for me, this if we think about carbs and fats, and then protein as well, these are our three main macronutrients, and all can be used as fuel. A lot of the discussion seems to talk about, in the 80s, we went high carb, low fat, essentially, and now low carb, high fat is hitting the rounds. And there's a lot of very passionate, very knowledgeable scientists, researchers, coaches, etc., on both sides of the camps. And there seems to be in the science quite a lot of research around both. I know for myself, I've been through both. And in recent times, in the last couple of years, I'm on carnivore, which would essentially be a high fat, low carb approach. And I think you've been doing the same. So yes, high carnivore would be there. A high carb, low fat approach may be considered vegan, but it doesn't have to be. I think, but you're looking at predominantly plant foods and grains. I'm guessing with little fats and when you're having meat, very lean cuts of meat as well. So that's sort of the two ends of the spectrum that we're looking at. I've certainly, I remember trying to manage my blood pressure and things like that on the DASH diet, and then reading about Dean Ornish, who was very successful reversing sort of blood pressure and heart disease risk, etc., with his high carb, low fat. But we now seem to be getting the same sort of results on keto diets and high fat, low carb diets. So yeah, if we then go just to try and set a broader context so that people know what we're going to be talking about. So yeah, what have we been doing for the last couple of years? Well, you probably longer in terms of low carb and stuff, I think. Do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. So I grew up eating a pretty decent diet, mostly whole foods diet that was very high in carbs, and blood sugar regulation was an issue for me even when I was young. So I would have big crashes in energy. And when I discovered a lower carb, higher fat way of eating, which was quite a while ago now, it's probably between 10 and 15 years ago, I started hearing about paleo diets and this type of thing, which could fit into the context of a low carb, high fat diet. That was transformative for me. Reducing carbs gave me much more consistent energy levels. I didn't have these crashes. And that really, really helped. My appetite was better regulated. And that was the beginning of looking into these types of higher fat, low carb diets. There's many variations. So that journey's been between 10 and 15 years, can't say exactly now. And over that time, it's gradually evolved. I'd say the last 3 to 4 years, I've been eating a mostly carnivore diet. There's been a few breaks in there, mostly during traveling, where it's been difficult to stick to that. And within that carnivore template, there's been some variations in there, including dairy, taking dairy out, including a small amount of carbs, taking carbs out altogether, some slight tinkering around, but predominantly for the last 3 to 4 years, very high fat, moderate protein, very low carb. And that was something I arrived at gradually from diets that were similar, that probably had more plant foods in there. Ketogenic diets was the bridge to getting there. So I think it's worth talking about what we were actually trying to achieve. I think what drew us to these types of diets.
I was
Um,
going to ask you what drew you to
mm,
this low carb, high fat version. You know,
yeah,
what was the trigger there,
mm,
or
yeah.
set
Well,
of triggers?
certainly the first thing that I mentioned was the more consistent energy levels, not having crashes after meals, not having constant hunger, not getting hangry. All of those three things were solved by having more fat and less carbs. Um,
And was that,
Generally,
sorry to butt in there, but
that's fine.
prior to that, what actually, before you experienced that, what drew you to change that?
What drew me to change it? I think it was probably just hearing about paleo diets. Rob Wolf and people like that were talking about this more ancestral approach. Um, I was eating all the time. I couldn't go anywhere without having snacks packed with me in case my blood
Yeah,
sugar dropped and I lost my temper. So I
yeah,
constantly had to carry food with me everywhere. It seemed ridiculous. Didn't seem like a very resilient state. Um, yeah, the ancestral way of eating or paleo way of eating made sense to me. Um, so to explain that in broad terms, it was removing more modern sources of carbohydrates, so things like refined carbs, things like bread and cereals. There's still some carbs in there, but they were more in the form of whole foods. But the overall amount of carbs in general is reduced hugely. So if there were any carbs, it would probably be some root vegetables, some fruit. And I wasn't strict in terms of trying to hit, ketogenic, really high fat
yeah.
levels at that point. And that was enough to solve the energy level issue. Um, how about you? What was your first foray into the low carb, high fat world?
I think a bit like you, I go back to around 2006, 7. I started coming across CrossFit, and they were talking about paleo diets then. Up until then, a bit like yourself, our home cooked food for the majority of certainly at home was, you know, meat and veg and potatoes, or rice and pasta in sort of more my teens. I think my breakfast cereal was common from very early on in my life, from ready bread, Weetabix, but also then cornflakes and things like that. Crunchy nut cornflakes when they came along, used to love that.
Yeah.
Cornflakes, the sugar and milk, spooning that out from the cornflakes. Um, I didn't like porridge, but I did love ready break. Porridge was too thick and gloopy and too difficult to eat for me, whereas ready break just, and I would have sugar and ribena on it.
Ribena on it. Wow.
Yeah, yeah, oh, heaven. Um, However, when I look back now, I was very emotionally reactive in school. Got into a lot of disputes, stroke fights, got bullied. I think because I was so reactive, I was an easy source to pick on because I could flare up quite quickly. Um, I was physically really, really active and needed to be. Um, so yeah, mentally there, I was sharp. I was sharp as a tack in lessons and stuff. That was all good. But I did have these really sort of angry emotional outbursts. And when I got older into later life, and bear in mind I went to university, messed around there, drank far too much alcohol, so disrupted the system in many ways, lots of late nights, etc., a lot more junk food, a lot of takeaways. When I was married, we got into getting a bit more of a health kick, and mum had, in earlier years, had always tried to solve things through diet and stuff, and we'd gone through everything. One particular one stood out that I remember quite enjoying was the Scarsdale diet, which was essentially steak and greens. So that was maybe my first exposure to that, and that was, I think, in the 80s or 90s. But then I think it was doing CrossFit, introduced to paleo. I then got cancer, and that was the major thing when I started looking at that. I mentioned this in other episodes. Remove added sugars, refined grains, and seed oils, vegetable oils. So I did that Mediterranean stroke Southeast Asian style for a while. And then I followed the Budwig protocol, which was vegetarian, but still very high fat, lots of coconut oil and lots of flax oil, and lots of dairy protein in the form of cottage cheese. But essentially, I loved meat. The Budwig protocol did amazingly for me. And I was calmer, but I also, I was doing a lot less. I wasn't working at this time. I had a lot less stress. I tried to balance my circadian rhythms, getting lots of sunshine, lots of grounding, lots of gentle aerobic exercise, and lots of other things impacting that. I got into intermittent fasting because this had been something with cancer. Also 1 meal a day type stuff. And I got to the stage where I was getting very cold. I was lean, but cold. My skin was dry and scaly. My hair started falling out after it had grown back from chemotherapy. And I came across the Ray Peat school of thinking.
Just to be clear, at this point, were you still eating a Budwig type diet, or was there some meat in there as well?
So I'd moved on from Budwig. I did Budwig for about 2 years post cancer. So from around 2009 to 2011. Then I started looking at the more a low carb meat based approach, paleo, with lots of fasting. I did that. So by that stage, I'd read Budwig had said that meat was fine if it was wild. And whilst I didn't get into the nitty gritty of the science, I sort of did, but I was easily swayed by book descriptions of stuff without really understanding the underlying physiology. But I got into low carb, but it was almost like really overdid it with the fasting and stuff, and started getting all of the hair falling out and stuff like that. Still eating loads of plant foods, lots of greens, but it was all spinach, that type of food, kale. So whilst I felt good and I was fit, etc., but I had this extreme cold, which I had from chemotherapy as well, but my morning body temperature was 35.2 or something like that when I was waking up. And I think 36 and a half is recommended. So I ended up eating for heat, which was a book Matt Stone came across, which was very much high carb, this, that, and the other. And I put on ridiculous amount of weight really, really quickly, and that was horrible in a way, but I felt good. My body temperature came up. And then, so this is taking me to 2014, 2015. Then all sorts of shit happened in my life. And since I've come back from that, I've been trying to manage my weight through circadian rhythms and just trying to eat normally, trying to cut out the processed stuff, but not dramatically. I'm still having pizzas, the odd takeaway. And then 2 years ago, just over 2 years ago, I piled on a load of weight again through eating breakfast cereal late at night for basically just logistical reasons for what was going on in my life. couldn't go through it again, and through that process came through protein sparing modified fasting and then carnivore, which I thought was absolutely ridiculous at the time. Bizarrely, I remember first thing about carnivore, and I can't do that. I'd spent years believing vegetables were the way forward, especially with cancer, because everyone was saying about red meat and cancer. But yeah, got into this carnivore, experimented. It was a 30 days, then 3 months, and oh shit, things are going really well. So I'll keep it on. And 2 years down the line, I'm there. Is everything perfect? I still not perfect, but pretty good. So that's me as quickly as I can say it with my ADHD.
Yeah, I think we've been on pretty similar paths. I didn't do the Budwig protocol, but certainly paleo and a lot of intermittent fasting. That's an interesting little journey in itself, because I ran into similar issues. The low body temperature, palpitations. I'd heard, I think it might have been Dave Asprey and a couple of other people. I'm just blanking on the guy's name now. Lean Gains was his website,
Oh
and
yeah,
he's very
yeah.
Martin something. He was very persuasive with his arguments for
Scandinavian name.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Lean Gains. That yeah. Looked at that a lot. Yeah.
So yeah, I think it illustrates a wider point that there's some people out there who are very good salesmen for their ideas, charismatic guys like this guy. He looks great, and he says his secret was, well, his formula. It's not really a secret because he's talking about it openly. But his formula was a type of fasting. I think he was doing 18-6 fasting, so it was 18 hours where he doesn't eat, and then during the 6 remaining hours, he'd eat 2 meals, pretty much eating whatever he wanted. And there's pictures of him on his website looking extremely lean and muscular.
I think
So there's
he used to boast about being able to maintain an 8% body fat all year round, not having to cut whatever that
Mhm.
he just maintain that the way he ate.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So if this illustrates, I think, my tendency to fall for the spiel of some of these people, which I've done many times. I probably will do, continue to do so. Um, I felt terrible most of the time I was doing this intermittent fasting, but some of my peers were doing it as well. It becomes a little bit of a badge of honor of, oh yeah, I don't eat till lunchtime because I'm so mentally tough that I can go without food, and it becomes something that maybe you are actually bragging about a little bit. But if I'm honest, I don't think I saw any benefits from it whatsoever. I think I only saw costs from it. Particularly, I started to get palpitations as it got later in the morning. I was getting hungrier and hungrier, and around about that time, I just developed a total intolerance to caffeine, which now looking back makes sense. At that point, without getting too deeply into the physiology, I believe I was probably running on some stress hormones in the morning. That's probably why I was getting the palpitations, little hits of adrenaline to get me through to lunchtime when I'd have my first meal. Throw some caffeine on top of that, and you're probably just overloading the system with too much stimulation of those stress hormones. So the point I'm making, the 2 points I'm making is one, there are people out there who put across very convincing arguments, and it's easy to sort of get excited about these ideas and jump on board with what they're promising or what they're saying, the benefits that they've had personally. And the second is that sometimes we get so attached to these ideas, like I was with the intermittent fasting, that I didn't want to admit that it wasn't working. I'd convinced myself that logically it made sense. I'd read material, I'd listened to podcasts, I'd heard loads of people say things which made sense to me. Although I actually didn't feel very good, but I stuck with it for years. I stuck with this rigid formula for at least a couple of years. Yeah, probably longer. And then I down regulated it a little bit. I shortened the length of those fasts, but that still remained in my mind for a long time, that I needed to have these periods of more than 12 hours out of 24 where I didn't eat. And I think if we move maybe more towards what got us interested in carnivore. For me, it was a couple of people, particularly I think Sean Baker, also Paul Saladino, who is no longer eating a strict carnivore
Yeah, yeah.
diet. Again, very charismatic guys. They both look great. They're in good, in enviable shape. I'm sure no one would argue with that. Talk very confidently and about the benefits that they've had. They both have a medical background. I think Sean Baker's a surgeon. I think
He was a military
Saladino's
surgeon,
an MD. So that that adds some weight, or it can add some perceived authority to what they're saying. And there's many other people who are discovered after that. There's a lot of medical professionals in the carnivore world who are very persuasive in what they say. And I think the key things that they were talking about that interested me was improved recovery from exercise, improved gut health, improved energy levels overall. And I was struggling with a few things. I would say generally I'm a pretty healthy person. Definitely, I would say, compared to somebody who doesn't really give much thought to their health, I'm doing great. But if I'm totally honest, for somebody who is quite invested in health practices, I still had some issues that I wanted to solve, and I wasn't very happy with where I was. So, the gut health issues, poor sleep, and chronic injuries, and the low body temperature persisting. Those are all things which I was looking to solve, and got into carnivore to see if those things would improve. How about you, Mike?
So yeah, I want to take like you mentioned about intermittent fasting. I think this is our human psychology aspect, of more is better. So intermittent fasting for myself worked incredibly well for a period of time, and then I sort of tried to push the envelope on it, and it was almost like, I started seeing my abs and things like that, and so I thought, right, I'm going to make this even more. I went to the 1 meal a day stuff, and a bit like yourself, I did glory in being able to go out for a curry at night and be able to stuff my face. I would be very low carb. I would have lots of vegetable dishes and a couple of meat dishes, and people would, oh Mike, how can you eat so much and be looking like you were, and that sort of fed the psyche. I've got to do more of this, and you end up pushing yourself into a zone which is like, well, actually now it doesn't seem to be working quite so well. So when I think back to that, I think it worked for a bit and then it didn't work. Now this is something I'm seeing, and I think we'll come on to the high carb, low fat, or low carb and high fat, the differences between the two. And I think it is context, is that all of these people were in a context at a time when their approach worked for them. Now, my question is that context stable? One, within a day, and two, over days, weeks, months, and years. Does that context remain the same? And therefore, should the solution remain the same the whole time, the way we do things? And I think over time, I've come to realize that context is not stable. We know from circadian rhythms that different hormones, different stress hormones are elevated early in the morning. They reduce at night, or in theory should do if we're tied to our biology in that sense. We have sunshine during the day. We have moonlight at night, or darkness at night. So the context is very different. We have different seasons, warm weather, summer, spring and summer, and we have cold seasons. So again, the context is different. Are you sick? Are you healthy? If you're sick, the types of food that you typically crave or want are very different, or indeed that you can tolerate are very different to when you're fit, healthy and resilient. So my ex-wife was really she was a fantastic example of this. Is when she was feeling poorly, it was like suet pudding and custard or that type of food. It took me a long time before I ever got into that, because I think school did such a good job of putting me off with school dinners. But I love curry and Chinese and stuff like that. And Michelle did, but only when she was feeling really good. When she wasn't, it was no, I want my traditional bland English food. Sorry for calling English food bland, but that's just my family background. Sorry. That being said, I eat carnivore now, which is predominantly carnivore, which is meat and salt. And some people would say, well, is that not boring and bland? And yeah, that's part of the discussion later on. But what was the original question you asked? I've gone off on one.
What were you trying to solve with carnivore, and what drew you to it?
Carnivore, well, several things. I was following Keegan Smith, who we met through Keegan, and it was his S&C stuff, and it was about the best way to become more athletic in the short term was to lose weight and improve your power to weight ratio. So that was what first drew me into his solution for that, which was a protein sparing modified fast, which was essentially lean meat only to counteract the protein breakdown that happens when we do just pure fasting. So, when I researched this, I realized I had a book about it from 10 years prior, written by Lyle McDonald, and it was called Rapid Fat Loss. And it has, in fact, been used clinically for a long time. It's understood that when we fast, we break down our muscle. So it was theorized that if you ate enough lean protein, you could still get the benefits of the fasting and supply the energy needs and the protein needs from the protein you took in. And I tell you what, it worked phenomenally. I put on weight over 2 or 3 months when my mum and dad moved up, and I'd gone through so much weight loss issues, or my weight going up and down over the years, that I just sod it. I was going to say fuck it there, sorry. I'm going to go for rapid weight loss. I'd always been taught as an instructor it was unhealthy as a fitness instructor and personal trainer, but I did a little bit of research into that and found some which said, well, actually, people who managed to lose weight rapidly were more likely to keep it off in the long term and felt more motivated. They saw the results, which kind of makes sense. 1 to 2 pounds a week, you don't really see much, and water and for women, menstrual cycles and stuff, and salt and water retention is so difficult doing that journey. 1 to 2 pounds a week, you have to be incredibly self-disciplined and self-motivated to do that. So I did the protein sparing modified fast for 3-4 weeks. Didn't enjoy it at all, but did my usual geeking out on the research and started coming across these references to the carnivore diet. And a bit like yourself, the big one for me, the promise of quicker physical recovery and less physical pain. I had just started it was 2 years into my squash coaching journey, which I started very late in my mid-50s, and my body was in bits. It was in bits. After a day of coaching, I could barely walk down the stairs. I had to use the handrails to use my arms. I was sore and achy all day. My joints hurt. And I thought, well, okay, I'm going to give this a go, because that sounded very appealing. And within a month of doing that, I'd noticed, muscle soreness and joint pain after my day of squash was far, far less. And no, if at all, I was fatigued, but not sore, didn't ache. So that was the first thing that really drew me in. And then it was the mental side of things. I hadn't really paid attention to this, but I heard a couple of interviews online where people had mentioned this sort of mental calmness that comes over them. And if you remember to earlier what I said, all my life I've been emotionally reactive, hangry, up and down. Um, and that was particularly, very noticeable in my marriage, the hangry stuff, all of our arguments, either after alcohol or me being hungry. And I started noticing, well, I was just calm. But then I think 3 months into carnivore, I stopped it for a day to go out on Father's Day, had a curry, had rice, had naan breads, had ice cream, had some alcohol. And next day, I had a flaming row with Mum. And we had been rowing early doors, but for a while we hadn't. And when I asked her about it, can you remember the last time we rowed? Was it before or after I started my meat only diet? Oh, it's a long time ago. Yeah, I think definitely before you started. So the dots started connecting for me there. And especially with my ADHD diagnosis, because I've got a book on ADHD which talks about high protein, high fat diet as well, which I pretty much didn't want to follow because of this idea of protein being bad for cancer. So I started reading research. And so for me, it was actually Paul Saladino's book, which was so in depth and had what I felt at the time really good scientific arguments to counter all the vegetarian arguments that I'd come across and all the high carb arguments. So that was very, very appealing. And then the likes of Anthony Chaffee came along, Sean Baker, and their athletics, what they had talked about, their athletic prowess. And then Keegan had alluded to the All Blacks and Sonny Bill Williams and stuff like that. And I'm thinking, well, if Sonny Bill Williams can play world-class rugby on carnivore, I should be able to play squash. So the experiment extended. And 2 years in, I'm still there. What I would say is a bit like yourself, mentally, I got to the stage where I started seeing my abs, and this was fueled a little bit by Keegan and his cutting protocol and stuff like that. And also the taking on ketones, exogenous ketones, that was interesting. I dropped from 11 stone. I've been fairly steady on 11 stone, 70 kilos. And then within space of 2 or 3 weeks from taking exogenous ketones and MCT oils, I dropped another 1/4 of a stone. And then I thought, oh, wow, maybe I can get to this below 10% body fat and all of this. And I don't know whether it's culturally, the magazines or whatever. I remember saying to myself a long time ago, I want to look like Bruce Lee. And I started trying to dive deeper down the rabbit hole. Thankfully, I stopped very, very quickly because I felt like shit. and I've gone back to actually trying to make sure I'm eating more and eating more fat at the moment. And occasionally I will delve in, I'll have a chocolate. And if I'm ill, which is not happening that often, but that's when I really crave sugar. But yeah, carnivore, for me, the lack of pain from my physical activities, joint pain, muscle pain, the mental calmness, and having a six pack. I'm going to be honest about that.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So I think some of the issues that I was trying to solve, so it was the low body temperature, aches and pains as well, and gut health, and this issue that I was having with palpitations. Diet can definitely be a factor in all of those things, but so can other factors. General stress, the aches and pains could be from how you're training and how much you're training. So it's quite hard to pinpoint it just down to diet. You've got to look at the big picture. You've got to look at how everything's working together. So I'd summarize by saying sort of 3 to 4 years on the mostly carnivore diet, gut health has improved, but nothing else that I was trying to solve has really shifted significantly.
Mhm.
Certainly not for the better. I could say that some of those things have maybe got a little worse. The gut health one's interesting as well because, as I've mentioned before, I really do think that stress levels are huge in this. During that 3 to 4 years of carnivore, there's been a couple of times where I've travelled overseas, Thailand, for quite a good length of time, and it's been a little harder to stick to a low carb diet just because culturally the foods aren't as easy to come by. During those times, I've introduced some carbs. At one point, I introduced quite a lot of carbs, and gut health was fine, never better. So what I'm saying is there that both on carnivore with 0 carbs and on a not really carnivore with quite a lot of carbs, I've achieved better gut health. So there's more than one way of solving these problems. So you mentioned when you've got enough energy coming in from fat, you generally feel better, and you had a moment where you were getting leaner, but you didn't feel great. So I think that probably is a good segue into this question of energy sources.
Yeah.
A potential pitfall on a low carb ketogenic diet, I think you'd agree on this, is it's quite appetite suppressing. So suppressing appetite is often talked about as a positive thing. There's an assumption that everybody's eating too much and we need to eat less. And if we eat less, we're going to generally be leaner and healthier. It's the calories in, calories out model. So a diet that suppresses appetite seems like it would be beneficial based on that model. But I think we just need to be really careful with our language and be clear about what we're talking about here. When we say suppressing appetite, to what extent are we talking about here? Are we basing this on an assumption that our appetite is too high? Um,
So
Appetite regulation would make sense to me as a term that seems a bit more useful, having an appropriate level of appetite.
yeah.
The potential pitfall, I think, on a very high fat diet like a carnivore or keto diet is that you can end up under eating quite easily. Would you say your experience reflects that?
Um. So I think I think the body has, again, this is the context that comes in here. Um, when I've studied fasting, for instance, um, the body, for the first 2 or 3 days of fasting, you probably still do feel hungry initially, especially if you're coming from a carb-based diet. Um, when we explore Jay Feldman, the Ray Peat approach on energy balance and that high carbs, we see that that does appear to be the case. Yeah, keto, low carb being appetite suppressing. I think again, it's the choice of the words. We use appetite suppression because predominantly it seems that people eat too much. So yes, we see appetite suppression as a good thing. I agree with you. Appetite regulation is what should happen. And I think the issue we have is when we consciously try and do something rather than letting the body do what it needs to do. So that appetite suppression or regulation, the change in appetite, let's just call it the change in appetite for me when I lost this quarter of stone taking it, what had I done? I changed and I started taking supplements. I started taking MCT oil and exogenous ketones. That for me was the potential mistake. I think it is a tool that is possibly useful for various reasons. So actually if you wouldn't have access to exogenous ketones and MCT oil on a standard whole food diet, not it doesn't happen. Exogenous ketones come in either liquid or powder form. They're incredible. Yeah, they are a processed food. MCT oil is a processed food. It's a specific chain, medium chain triglyceride extracted from typically coconut oil, but also found in goat's milk and stuff like that. It's processed food. So for me, I think actually, again, when we talk about ketogenic diets or low carb diets, there's so many different ways to interact with these. I found my best results, when I felt the best, is when I haven't tried to meddle too much with all of these extra things, get sucked into the promise, the lure of all of these different things, the low body fat percentage, this, that, and the other, not trying to consciously control what's going on, and getting sold by, even some of the gurus here. Richard Smith is one of my favorite keto experts, carnivore people, but he's a big advocate of these exogenous ketones. Dave Asprey again, and I think I'd noticed it because I felt sharper on it, having had a bulletproof coffee with butter and MCT oils. So I think that meddling with all these extras around the side can lead to that. Yes, I believe undereating, because when you're having those ketones and stuff, it's signaling you don't need to eat as much, and that can be a risk. I think similar things have happened to vegans and stuff. The satiety factor that potentially comes more from the fiber, and potentially some of the fermentation that's going on. Again, very easy to undereat with these extreme whole food diets, or what we consider extreme. They're at different ends of the spectrum. But we've also been totally conditioned by an overriding of appetite with the mix of fats and carbs and junk foods with all the other additives in them in the middle that the majority of the population are eating. So I think if you're eating vegan, or a whole food vegetarian, maybe with some dairy or fish or whatever, or you're eating carnivore, you don't want to be suppressing appetite, because then your appetite in those circumstances is regulated well. You don't need appetite suppression. So then to take measures where that does happen, like I took on ketones and MCT oil, not to suppress appetite, it was more for mental focus. But what I realized, it did suppress my appetite. If, however, you're on this mixed food thing, then the term suppression makes more sense. But actually, if you just turn to eating carnivore or vegetarian or whatever, a whole food based diet, it will seem like your appetite is being suppressed, but in fact it's just returning to normal regulation. That's my take on it.
Okay. So let me see if I've understood that. I'll try and just quickly summarize. So in the modern context of processed foods, many of these foods do stimulate appetite and can increase the amount of energy that we're consuming, and whilst not being particularly nutritious.
Yes.
So in that context, it might seem like you want to reduce your appetite. Eating pretty much any type of whole foods, unprocessed foods diet is likely to control your appetite in a more favorable, more suitable way, whether that is a vegetarian diet or a carnivore diet. I think it becomes all of a sudden quite a lot harder to overeat when you're only eating whole natural foods. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, and I would add to that, I think it's because we talk about food as fuel, which is one of the things I want to question about the Jay Feldman and the high carb approach. We talk about that, but in one of our previous podcasts, we've talked about nutrient sensors. And you mentioned Marty Feldman's work, where he analysed, I think, 500,000 plus MyFitnessPal data or whatever, and found that when people ate more protein, they typically reduced calories. Now, I don't want to call that good or bad, but it goes to this appetite regulation. When we eat the foods that nature supplied, our appetite seems to regulate better. As a byproduct of that, calories typically seem to be less, typically, than in our modern industrialized diet fueled way. Many other things are happening there. So, yeah, I think the body has appetite regulation systems which we should allow to be used, but we need to allow them to be used. And it's not just down to food. It comes down to things like sleep. If you wake up in the middle of the night, the body tends to want to overcompensate with food. Studies have shown. Stress. The high carb energy balance crowd will talk about sugar being a stress reliever, but also so is salt and fat. There are many different stress relievers. So managing our stress levels is key. And I think something that strikes me about your experience with this is, I think it's something if psychologically, you seem to be a bit more stressed, I guess. That word we've talked about this sometimes, about what you feel is important. That there's a lot of, I need to do this, get this right, this, that, and the other. For quite a few years, I've gone down the path of trying to minimize that to my detriment, and I think that may show the different results we've had with low carb in that sense. In that, I think when the overall stressors mount up, a dietary approach can exacerbate that. And I think that's what I've seen with myself, is when I pushed it and I really pushed the fasting and cutting the calories and everything, that's when it started falling apart for me. I think we need to be careful in losing weight, because we see that's a symptom. We always talk about weight, but what's the weight? Our body fat, our composition, I think, is a byproduct of everything else. But yeah, the psychological stresses, the emotional stresses all play into this as well. So whilst we're trying to focus on the nutrition today, I think we need to remember that things like adequate daylight, adequate sleep, how we get all of that, does play a role.
Yeah, I think this really gets into the heart of the argument between the low carb and low fat camps, and what we're exploring at the moment. And we've mentioned a few names, so maybe if we explain who those people are a little bit, anyone listening can look into their work some more. So we both mentioned Paul Saladino, who was a carnivore advocate, and then has changed his view somewhat. Now he advocates for an animal-based diet, but includes a lot of carbs in there, mainly from fruit. You can have a look at some of his material, and you'll find out, what his reasons were for that. And we also, you've mentioned Ray Peat and Jay Feldman, who are voices within the bioenergetic world. So the bioenergetic world, in very, very simplified terms, tends to be quite opposed to the ketogenic world, in that they talk about their the ideal main fuel source being carbohydrate rather than fat. Now, it's not quite as simple as that. There is actually quite a bit of crossover between these two apparently conflicting tribes. There is still quite a lot of crossover. They're talking about whole foods. They're talking about avoiding certain anti-nutrients. They are talking about the bigger picture of managing stress and circadian rhythms and these types of things. So their views aren't completely at odds with each other. The main area that they disagree is on the ideal fuel source. Now, the bioenergetic view, and I think we can say Paul Saladino is probably more on that side now than a carnivore side, although I don't think he really uses the words bioenergetic much. They would argue that fueling yourself on fat relies on the stress hormones. And this is something that we've been exploring the last few days and really diving into biochemistry and trying to figure out where we, what we think about this. And their argument is that for the body to use fat as a fuel source, it requires the stress hormones, glucagon, cortisol, adrenaline, to stimulate producing energy. And if that is the case, and perhaps you have other stresses in your life, as we were talking about, perhaps you have general psychological stress, work stress, stress from how you're training, perhaps, is throwing a dietary stressor on top of those going to be a good idea? At this stage, I'm going to be perfectly honest, I don't know what the answer to this is, but it's something that I'm willing to explore, and I'm thinking about a change in how I've been doing things for quite some time. It's been, as I said at the beginning, 10 to maybe 15 years I've been on a low-carb diet. So I'm considering going back into carbs as my main fuel source. But it won't be, I think, the same as it was previously. I'm not going to suddenly jump back into eating breakfast cereal. And you were talking about ready brek, these like low fat, extremely high carb meals that I think you and I both probably grew up on and continued having into later life. So it's going to remain within a whole foods template. What are your views so far? I know you explored the bioenergetic view quite a while ago as well.
Yeah, and
So you might have looked
yes,
into it more than I have.
I don't know. I mean, I looked at it. I found Ray Peat's writing very, very hard to read. It's like his essays, his articles. There were certainly nuggets of information in there. I was swayed by the body temperature thing a lot, and the idea of thyroid. And obviously, there's a lot of people will say on low carb ketogenics, oh, your body temperature or your thyroid goes down, and you need that for metabolism, etc. You mentioned stress hormones. Interestingly, you included glucagon in there, which is very much a bioenergetics viewpoint, that glucagon is a stress hormone. I mean, first off, what do we mean by stress hormones? That's something that I think I'm not sure any of us are really 100% clear on. We call them stress. It's a physiological stress. It's to supply energy. From my fight, it's like, when we're in fight or flight, we need to supply energy. Absolutely essential, because if we don't do that, we die. We have to have physiological stress in our lives. Glucagon's interesting. Again, still researching for me. Glucagon seems to work counter to insulin, and there's supposed to be an interplay between those two. Now, I would suggest in a normal, healthy person in everyday life, well, there should be an interplay with these things, because insulin is about storing stuff. That's one of its functions. And then we also need the ability to release food. For the bioenergetic side of things, I think my reading of what they're saying is they're looking at people who are essentially carb adapted, and a low carb diet is very stressful. And when you go through those periods of adaptation, then yes, it can be an added stress. From the carnivore field, bits and pieces I've heard of have suggested that cortisol levels, once you're fully adapted, all of that normalizes. And I think that's the problem we have at the moment. We don't have enough long-term research on keto, carnivore, etc., to fully understand whether actually glucagon in that context is a stress hormone. That's the question I want to ask. I take on board what the bioenergetics people are saying, and I do agree. I just think it's very difficult to avoid a stressful life. Stress, chronic stress is the issue here. And if I agree with what you said, is if fasting, for instance, when you're already stupidly stressed than very other sorts, is not a way forward. But if you're healthy, resilient, every now and then I think a fast is great, and there are all sorts of positive benefits to it. My mistakes, I think I've ended up overdoing it at levels. I've noticed when I include more fat in my food, I'm less prone to the stress, etc. The temperature thing is like what should our temperature be? There's a paleo writer who suggests that our body temperature shouldn't be as high, and that's something I want to cover, research a little bit more. Yes, my hands are cold now. All I've had today is a coffee with MCT oil, and that is probably some form of stress response. Is that a good thing? Probably not. Are there other benefits? Possibly. So what I did find with the bioenergetics side was that I had to eat, and I found that difficult. I'm not sure with the results I'm having at the moment, there's not enough to make me want to change and try, but I understand that you're at a place where that's something that what they're saying seems to make sense. And I think that's, we've got to explore that. One thing that comes across to me, and I'd like to introduce this, is this idea of the Randall cycle. Why it seems that we have this ability to use fat, we have this ability to use carbs. Why are we arguing about which one? Are there different relationships? Obesity obviously is a big thing. And there's this, many people who look into their health will have heard of like the Krebs cycle, how we produce ATP and stuff like that. The Randall cycle, from my understanding of it, is basically a decision maker on which fuel gets used to create that ATP. Whether it's the fat that you get to use or whether it's the glucose that you get to use. And that can have an impact how that works, and that potentially will decide some of the long-term outputs that's happening with our outcomes for our health in terms of inflammation and things like that. So that's something that at some stage in this, if we can, I've got a layman's guide to it from Dr. Ab's podcast, if we can go through that at some stage. But I think it explains, to give a spoiler alert, it explains why either a high fat, low carb approach can work or a high carb, low fat approach can work. And many people's interpretation of the Randall cycle is that you need to be at one end or the other, and it's in the middle where the issues occur.
Yeah, I think just clarifying why there is an argument is really important. Why don't we just have carbs and fat? Why don't we just fuel ourselves with both? Well, it seems that when you put the two together in quite high amounts, it can lead to weight gain quite quickly. It seems to stimulate appetite and overeating, so that's a potential issue there. The once we start getting really into the weeds with stress hormones and the Randall cycle, um, this this stuff can be pretty difficult to get your head around, and um, I think there's a potential risk of tracking biomarkers. Let's just use the parallel of looking at cholesterol. So cholesterol is something that people have become really focused on. It's a number, it's a blood marker that we can look at as a potential indicator of heart health. But once you start looking into that closely, it becomes very debatable about whether this is actually a good indicator to look at. And I think we could easily fall into the same traps with some of the ideas around stress hormones. Are we measuring them accurately? Is taking a cortisol test once in the day giving you the complete picture of what your cortisol is over the long term, for example?
And
So
what are we
the
basing our interpretation on that as well? Why are we
yeah,
saying it's bad or good? Because again, this
yeah,
is this context thing.
yeah.
Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, so I was just going to say, at the moment, I'm still keeping things really quite high level and thinking about, well, um, what do we all actually want to do? We actually want to feel fit and healthy. We want to feel well. We want to feel like we've got energy. We probably don't want to have cold hands and feet. We probably don't want to have palpitations. We want to have a good night's sleep and wake up feeling like we've got plenty of energy. We don't want to be super sore after we've exercised. And I think right now these are probably better things to track, and that's what I'm tracking. Um, it's these higher level outcomes. I'm not getting too focused on blood tests and any other things that we could
Mm.
measure. That stuff is useful. It has. I'm not saying we throw it out altogether, but the ultimate outcome that we're looking for is to feel good. Um, and I definitely felt foul of that previously. I mentioned my story with the intermittent fasting, where I was doing
Mm.
something that I thought was the right way to go, even though it was making me feel pretty terrible. So I'm just trying to remember that lesson while I explore this potential new avenue. Um,
Yeah. I think the
you've
cold hand
mentioned,
cold foot is interesting.
yeah,
Um, just I'm, and I think this is where how we feel. There's so many different factors. I'm loving this conversation. I've got cold hands at the moment, um, but I feel energized. Now,
mm,
people will argue that's the stress response, this, that, and the other. It could also be the dopamine reward from having this conversation and many things like that. It's something that we're both clearly passionate about. Um, I know someone who has extremely warm hands and they're extremely obese as well. Um, and so, again, each individual, I think, needs to measure what is how is their quality of life, how are they feeling. um I happier when I've got warm hands? Sometimes not. But it is something that I obsessed about for a long time. And I'm going to get the thermometer out and start testing my waking body temperature again, because it is interesting. I want to try and match all of these things. Um, yeah, I agree. The blood results. Mum wants me to go and get my bloods tested, and I don't want to get into the weed pool of that, of trying to understand and interpret what that even means. Um, even following the ideas of ketosis, trying to wrap my head around what is ketosis. Again, it's all about a blood measurement, but then when you explore even deeper, it seems it's very hard to keep ketosis. And indeed, the bioenergetics people talk about wolves not being in ketosis, despite the fact that they only eat meat and fat. But then, a discussion, an exploration I had with ChatGPT suggested, well, yeah, because you get more efficient at using ketones. So your blood levels don't accurately reflect what is going on at a cellular level. So it's like saying that the petrol tank's always empty. Well, that's because the fuel's being used really efficiently, potentially. If there's fuel that's in the petrol tank the whole time, but the car's sputtering, is there a blockage somewhere? So, I agree. Go by what you feel. And I think that's what everyone has to do, is like the science can point us in a direction, give us an area of investigation, but science is only as good as the assumptions that the science is based on. So, we've made that the assumptions over time we're realizing that those are wrong a lot of the time. For instance, I would hazard a guess the assumptions the bioenergetics people seem to be inferring, their assumptions are based on that we should be fueled by carbs. That's their reading of the biochemistry. The keto people, their reading of the biochemistry is that we should be fueled by fats. Someone else might come in and say, well, actually, we can do both. So surely we need both. Yeah, there's a reason for having both. And that it's somewhere in the middle, context specific, which is where I tend to be in terms of that. So in terms of managing your health, I think, yes, you're right. We need to what are our personal outcomes? Are we getting what we want out of what we're doing? And that's clearly not happening for you at the moment. And so that's why you've got to do what you've got to do. I am exploring as well, because it's not 100%. But there are other factors as well. I have sugar every now and then, and it's, I'll go for it. And it's like I'll have a mocha or a hot chocolate or whatever, and I think when we're healthy, we can afford to do more of these things. What gets us to being healthy is interesting. And I do think you need to be at either end of that spectrum to get the cells working properly. From my reading of certainly this Randall cycle thing, seems that it's a lot to put on one biochemical cycle. But it does kind of make sense when you tie together the bits of information that are coming out of it. We've grown up in a culture that chucks starchy carbs, simple carbs, proteins, fats, and lumps it all together in one thing called a sandwich or a pizza or an ice cream and stuff like that. And these are combinations of foods that have never ever been found in nature, bar potentially milk, which is simple sugars, protein, and fats, which is a growth food. So applying that evolutionary context to the science as well, I think, is important for each individual to get their grasp of what makes sense, not just to listen to any health expert, alleged expert, as we both are. I've changed my viewpoint over the years so many times. But I do reserve the right to do that as new information and new experiences comes along. We have to be able to be open to new information and change. But I've probably had the most consistent run of promising results, shall I say, for what I'm doing at the moment. Oh, I've lost you. You've gone quiet.
Yeah, I'm definitely known in my family and some friends for changing quite dramatically from one point of view to another periodically. But I think that's probably what you'll get from both of us. And what you said there, I think, was a good summary of the conversation as a whole. To avoid being dogmatic, to remember the big picture of what you're trying to achieve with your health. Try not to get sucked in by these charismatic people making big claims and big promises. There's plenty of them about. Although I'm sure I'll still fall victim to that again in the future. Yeah, keep it big picture. Remember what you're trying to achieve with your health in general. Certainly is interesting. It is useful to get granular on these things, but you will find, I think, in our experiences, that it leads to more questions.
Yeah, go on.
Yeah, no, I was going to suggest that. Yeah, I think we've probably come to a kind of natural conclusion with this one, unless there's anything else that you want to add.
You know me. There's always something else to
There's always one more.
add. So I do think. I think next podcast I want to explore the Randall cycle and how it informs how people can use it as a way to potentially inform what they're eating alongside how they feel. What I would say to that, though, is we're always getting new measuring techniques, new technology in science, and we can see more and more. And to me, it's a little bit akin to the stars in the night sky. When you're in a city and you look up, you can only see certain stars, or there may even be clouds, and then the clouds go away and you can see the stars. And, oh, God, look at all of this and do that. And then, we've got 10 stars there. That must be what is out there. But then you go out into the countryside up here in Kielder where they have an observatory and you can see thousands of stars. Where do they all come from? Have they just arrived? No, they're there. They're always there, or they were at the speed of light travels that were there 50,000 years ago or whatever. But it's like we get new information and science is continually allowing us to see more information. I mean, I don't even know how they can tell these things like the Krebs cycle and watching the electrons and the Randall cycle and understanding what enzymes there are and this, that, and the other and various transporters, how they even get to see these. But it's maybe that would be an interesting podcast as well, is how do we know this stuff, supposedly? But assumptions change, knowledge changes, and we need to be able to adapt to that. I think evolution gives a good lens in that if you look at a lion doesn't have to go through this conversation, doesn't need a health podcast to try and work out what to eat. It just eats what it eats, and it's drawn to eating meat for a lion. A cow eats what it eats. It eats grass. If it's out in the wild on its own, that's what it'll eat. We've kind of, with our intelligence and our ability to introduce all of this other stuff, we've now lost that ability, and science is potentially helping us to get back to a point where we know what we should do, but we've made so many wrong assumptions along the way based on seeing something, cholesterol, cortisol, insulin, in all of these conditions and jumping to the conclusion, we have to reduce cholesterol, high insulin, we need to reduce insulin, cortisol, high cortisol, we need to reduce cortisol, without really understanding how they work as a whole in the sort of the orchestra of life. There's many things going on all the time. We're not going to fully understand for a long, long time. So things like your general well-being, are you mentally down or up as a whole? If you are down, which is right, it's good to be down, can you bounce back? What's your waist measurement? That seems to be a reasonably low-tech measure to predict heart risk, heart disease risk. Doesn't need to be, if you've got decent waist measurement, less than half your height, then the chances are that you're going to be okay. That being said, you get to the point where you're having palpitations, heart arrhythmias, etc. I met a swimmer, full on athlete, 100% all the time. He had to stop because otherwise his heart was going to conk out on him. So nothing is a simple measure. People want quick fixes. We live in a world where there's loads of those available, but they don't do the job. You have to slowly understand over time, and that's a journey. And you have to be aware of your own body and your own mind, and start taking control of that yourself, and not be beholden to experts selling you one theme or another. Try and understand why something works. Our body and our mind are our prime piece of real estate, our asset, our major asset. We are the ones responsible for looking after it. I think what you and I are trying to do is understand how this works for ourselves, and share what we learn with others to help them follow that same journey to actually understand what makes us healthy. And we're going to, whilst we probably haven't simplified it today, we do have a set of frameworks by which to understand health, and try and simplify what we need to do. And for those of you who are interested, look out over the next few weeks. We'll be introducing a little mini course, Thrive by Design, which will look at how can we simplify understanding health and actually creating a life that makes being healthy easy. There you go. Finally, nothing left to add.
Okay, it's a wrap.